Awesome, great. So so hi everyone. My name is Josh Urban Davis. That background, I think, that introduction did a really great job of covering my previous work. I'm a graduate student in the last year of my PhD at Dartmouth. I have a background in visual arts and design, as well as computer science, and I largely function as an HCI researcher and new media artist. A little bit about me outside of my research is I maintain a new media arts practice that involves using algorithms and hardware and software computing in order to create animations, drawings, sculptures, interactive installations, weird satellite projects that we did in Venice. And I can talk more about that later if you'd like to hear. And on the far right is my lazy research assistant named Nocturne, who may make an appearance at some point during this talk. But as far as my research is concerned, I broadly like to think about creativity, what it is, how it functions, and what role it plays in our everyday lives. And I also like to say that I like thinking about accessibility. And sort of the overlap here is I like thinking about who is allowed to be creative by the tools that we use, and how is creativity supported by those particular tools. And so when thinking about our tools and our machines, I like to think about multimodal interfaces and how the different modes that we're able to interact with our machines indicate not only how we're able to be creative and productive with those machines, but also who is able to use and be creative with these systems. So to explore this, my research participates in several already interdisciplinary fields across human-computer interaction, generative algorithms, and novel multimodal systems. And a lot of my prior research publications exist at usually 2 or more of these intersections. And now that I'm looking at this slide, I realize it is very out of date. But so to begin with, I'd like to set some kind of ground rules and provide a concrete definition for what we mean by creativity, because creativity can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different thinkers and people. So it's nice to have a nice solid definition going in before we discuss it in a bit more detail. So this was part of a work done in collaboration with a number of really fantastic collaborators, including Miriam Sturdy, Michaela Lewis, Angelique Strohmeyer, Kara Spiel, Nadia Kaludu, and Sarah Fadolaloui. And essentially what we examined in this work, one of the things we examined in this work is what is creativity and how exactly does it become implemented and affected by the machines that we use on a daily basis. So we actually have a lot of extensive literature in the behavioral psychology domain that explores and gives a really nice definition for what creativity is. And it goes something like this. It's creativity is a rearrangement of pre-existing elements into something novel that reveals something fundamental about the world or ourselves. And this last part gets a little bit nebulous, and that's because oftentimes in the behavioral psychology literature, you'll see this phrase come up that it has to reveal something true about the world, and that just gets even more philosophically dicey. So I like this definition that kind of talks about how it reveals something fundamental. And so given this definition, we generally think about creativity being something that artists do. And while this is definitely true, artists definitely are creative people, but creativity is something that we practice every day in our daily experience. And so if you're an engineer, for example, and you're trying to find an appropriate configuration for a circuit, that involves a lot of different modes of creativity. Or if you're a research scientist and you're trying to find the right way to implement this experiment or different ways to analyze your data to reveal something interesting, that also requires a significant amount of creativity. And so while we do think of creativity being as something that artists do, we can learn from artists the different ways in which creativity can be supported and manifested. And our daily day-to-day tasks. And so I'd like to talk now about like 3 different species or characteristics of creativity, just so we have some characteristics to kind of grab onto as we continue this discussion. So the first species or characteristic I'd like to talk about is that creativity is divergent. It is a divergent mode of problem solving, meaning that the first step of creativity is finding as many solutions as possible to a given problem. And those of you who are familiar with Don Norman's work, creativity is often, or divergent mode of thinking is often the first step in the divergent convergent loop. So first, we have to look for as many solutions as possible to a specific problem, and then converge on a specific solution that is amenable and useful to the problem at hand. I was one time in a seminar and a philosopher said that nature was the ultimate divergent problem solver because nature tries to create as many solutions as possible to the problem of sustaining life. And so once we have generated all of these different solutions, we've thought of all the solutions that we possibly can to a given problem, we then have to converge. And so one way we can conceptualize the convergent process and the way that the convergent process intersects with our artifacts and machines is to think of creativity as being a cultural experience, or the convergent aspect of creativity being a cultural process. Because our creativity, our cultural and social practices alter and are altered by the specific solutions that we are examining. So this can either be, if you're a scientist trying to solve a problem, then you are existing in the culture of engineering, and your experience with other engineers will inform how you converge on the proper solution to the problem. Or if you are Emily Dickinson living alone, writing poems in the woods, then your cultural experience of reading these poets help you converge on the process of writing a powerful and evocative poem. And so finally, one final species or characteristic of creativity that I'd like to discuss today is this idea of mutability. And this means that any time that we have a tool or a system that allows us to be creative, the construction or design of that tool informs who is able to be creative and how they are able to experience that creativity. You can think of a paintbrush as a good example of this, right? So we have a paintbrush and it has a handle and bristles, and that can be used to smear paint around. But how that object is used and how it is held informs who is able to be creative and how they are able to experience creativity using that tool. Which, given these 3 species of creativity, what I'd like to ask then is, how do we support and enable creativity for everyone? And I had hinted at this earlier in the talk, but I'd like to come back to this idea of multimodal or even omnimodal interfaces, meaning interfaces or systems that have more than one way of interacting with them, or they engage more than one sense in the way that they interact with them. So this is one solution that I would like to propose to this problem, and I'd really like to explain to you now why that is. So I'd like to start by kind of taking up this last point about mutability and consider whose creativity we are supporting and what definitions of creativity we put forth in these systems that we make. So, for example, for those of you familiar with the maker community, the ability to create novel electronics is a powerful medium for extending human capabilities in a very tangible and very visceral way. And so participation in these so-called maker communities is a powerful entryway to support creativity, as well as provide advancement into future STEM education. But the problem is that often in the maker community, novices rely on information from the internet, which is, on the one hand, it's really beautiful. Like, there's so much free information available online that you can get to basically teach yourself how to be a hobbyist engineer. And you can learn it completely from the internet. And this is great. This is really, really cool. But one problem with this is that these tools and systems rely almost exclusively on schematics and diagrams that are two-dimensional, which if you have trouble seeing, if you're blind or a member of the visually impaired community, this makes it almost impossible for these systems to be used. And this is a real detrimental loss, right? Like, so when we started examining when we started conducting this project, one of our participants had laid this quote on me that said that blind people are some of the most creative people I know. We're born makers because the world was not made for us, so we have to recreate the world for ourselves to thrive. And this really stuck with me about how powerful it is to be able to give the means of creativity to as many people as possible. So this was the problem that we wanted to address in this particular project, was we wanted to see how was it that we can make these tools that are already available for free accessible to people who may be blind or visually impaired. And our solution was to create this parsing algorithm. So essentially what this algorithm does is it takes these 2D schematics and it parses them into a 3D diagram and an audio interface. So the 3D diagram can be printed using a commodity hard extrusion 3D printer, using conductive filament. All of this is very publicly available. And then the audio interface can be uploaded to a mobile phone. Any standard commodity touchscreen phone can do. And then you can place the 3D printed model of the circuit on top of the audio interface uploaded to the smartphone. And what this then allows you to do is then a person, oh yeah, here's a video of the assembly process. So then what happens is it allows the person to touch a model of the circuit, and when they touch each of the adjoining components of the circuit, the system reads audio information to them. I don't know if you can hear, but the video does have audio in it, basically reading information about how to construct this, the circuit to the person who's touching the object. And so this is cool, right? So now we have this system that allows you to create these sort of multimodal, tangible and audio tools for translating 2D information into a 3D object, which hopefully could make this easier for people who are blind or visually impaired, but also people who may not be blind or visually impaired as well, to learn how to construct these circuits. And so we wanted to understand exactly how effective this was for people. So we collaborated with Josh Maeli at Lighthouse in San Francisco. And he's this really fantastic, really inspiring engineer who is completely blind. And he runs a workshop for teaching other people who are blind to become engineers. And so we ran this study. Where we engaged with this workshop to allow them to use our tool to make whatever it is that they want. And it was really cool to actually see what people wound up making. Many of them wound up making tools such as a audio-based circuit connectivity tool so they could build other electronic tools later. And so that was really wonderful to see during this study. And this kind of points to one of the first takeaways from our study, which was that our machines often over-index on visual information. And it's really essential that we must design for tactile as well as visual use, or in a much more forward-thinking vision, design for multimodal or omnimodal use, where the sort of information that we are encoding can be used to engage a variety of senses and therefore lower the barrier of accessibility for as many people as possible. Because after all, the world is multimodal. The world is fundamentally engages more than one sense, and we are multimodal creatures, and yet our technologies fundamentally are not. And so there is this sort of overlap where flexibility and mutability allows for a system to sit within a user's preferences and abilities, which is to say that it makes them multimodal. And so we're especially sort of maybe hypersensitive to this overlap in the digital age. We'll talk about that a little bit later, since a lot of us for a while now mostly communicated through screens like I'm doing with you today. And maybe in some cases we're slowly coming out of talking on screens and talking in person again. But we're hypersensitive in these spaces where we're limited by the senses we can use to communicate with each other exactly how detrimental this is. So, which is all just to say multimodal and mutable systems have an overlapping relationship with being accessible and flexible. So this was part of the first part of this project, and maybe I should pause here for a second and say if there are any questions or comments, please, I can't monitor the text chat, so feel free to just yell them out and I'll pause and adjust. I think I don't know if I actually muted everyone a second ago, but then I did. Feel free, if you do have a question or a comment, just unmute yourself, and I'll be happy to chat with you. So while we were working on a follow-up to our tangible circuits project, a little known event occurred called COVID-19. Maybe you heard about it on the news. And essentially it fundamentally altered how we communicate and how we socialize. And notably, we now all had to not only stand very far apart, but we also had to wear masks as personal protective equipment, right? And we found that not only was this detrimentally made it difficult to communicate because, right, your mouth is muffled and now it's hidden. It was especially detrimental for people who already had trouble hearing to begin with. So we wanted to kind of explore in this project, how can we take something that's been inhibitive for how we communicate and make it more communicative. So this is how we started exploring this project that came to be known as the poker face mask. And so we wanted to explore if we could augment a mask with interactivity to allow for different mixed reality techniques to heighten the communication that we experience. And so this was one of the very early prototypes of this mask. It looks a little silly, but stick with me, I promise. My story gets better. Essentially what you're seeing here is on the front piece of this mask is a live video feed of the mouth and nose of the person who is wearing the mask. And what this live video feed can do is one, on top of being able to now see our face again, we now can use the built-in affordances of the smartphone to actually augment communication using the phone, right? So for example, we can use text-to-speech to display captions and create, real-life Netflix subtitles on the surface of the mask. We can also use the built-in microphone and speaker to amplify the audio that would have been muffled by the covering of the face. We can even do live translations to, I could speak into the mask in Spanish and the audio that comes out is in Japanese, so we can do live audio translations as well, in addition to doing video augmentation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So this is really neat. And so to answer your first question that you might be thinking about, yes, we did published this work before Lady Gaga's 2021 VMA performance. And yes, we did name the project after her hit song, Poker Face. Life imitates art or something. So I think this has a little bit of a demonstration of how the mask actually works. Again, this is one of the earlier prototypes. That's why it's made from cardboard. And so again, I don't know if the audio is actually coming through, but basically this is just a quick demo of how the prototype works when worn on the face. One of the things you may be thinking is that if you have your smartphone, normally the camera is not located at the center of the phone, and the camera is actually located off center. And so you may be wondering how difficult it is actually to map that periscope or that skewed visual input onto a flat surface of the phone. The answer is we tried multiple things, and it is very difficult to do. If you're curious about that, ask me during the Q&A section. And so one thing when talking about this work is that often we try to classify it and talk about it within different conference spaces of virtual reality and augmented reality. But a lot of the HCI literature and even the HCI research community has kind of pivoted to this idea that virtual and augmented reality must use a headset, right? There has to be a head-mounted display, or else it simply does not qualify as a form of like virtual or augmented reality. And this really is kind of a loss because it really limits and constrains our imagination for how we could use virtual and augmented reality techniques to create potential benefits. And it also, if you look at the history of virtual and augmented reality, some of you may recognize the diagram on this slide as being Paul Milgram's mediated reality and virtuality spectrum. I'll walk you through this right here. So like down here is supposed to be reality, just physical everyday interaction. And over here is virtuality. And so that's one axis. And the other axis is no mediation all the way up to full mediation. So the head-mounted display definition of virtuality would be up here in the top right-hand corner, severely mediated virtuality. And so the reason I bring this up here is that there is a whole spectrum of different spaces that we could examine applying augmentation and virtual reality techniques to try to find solutions to everyday problems that we might have in communication. So again, this is one example of how we might re-envision virtual or augmented reality being implemented to solve or mitigate a potential problem. It's a multimodal interface that allows, for lack of a better term, inclusive sociality, right? Because it allows people to communicate based on whatever their communication preferences are. And we did run a user study, both with people who were deaf or hard of hearing, as well as people who were not deaf or hard of hearing. And we did a co-design session as part of this project. And it was really kind of cool to see the sort of things that people wanted from this mask. Some people wanted an augmentation to their mouth and nose to where it looked like they were wearing makeup. Another person had complete virtual mediated augmentation where they had replaced their mouth and nose with a cat mouth that was smoking a cigarette, and they could move. They thought it was delightful that they could move the mouth and the cigarette. But one thing that came from this study was an observation by people who were not deaf and hard of hearing, was that lip reading and facial cues were vital to communication. And the reason I emphasize that this came from people who were not deaf or hard of hearing, it's because your friends who are deaf or hard of hearing definitely know that lip reading and facial cues are vital for communication. And so it was really fascinating for us to see that when comparing the accessibility and communicative effects of these masks that could and could not see the lips, the nose, the facial cues in communication, how pertinent this became. And this is kind of an example of what we can think of as is that accessibility is a magnifying lens. People with various disabilities are very hypersensitive to the frictions in communication methods, and thus this can indicate to us as researchers where there is room for work to be done, where we can actually improve computation. And there are loads of examples throughout the history of computation of accessibility works that became things that we use in our everyday lives, right? Like, for example, cruise control, which became autonomous, the field of autonomous car driving research was originally an accessibility project. And of course, the kind of rich domain of subtitles, which largely started out as closed captioning for the hearing impaired. These were projects that a lot of us use in our daily lives that started out as accessibility projects, because I know I certainly can't watch Netflix without subtitles. But again, this points again to how multimodal flexibility creates a space that is not only accessible, but also provides a space that allows for creativity to flourish as well, right? Because you have more means and modes to express yourself according to your preferences and likes. So this kind of covers a little bit of the work that we've published so far in this particular line of inquiry. What I'd like to move on to next is kind of looking at some work that is currently under development. Before I move into that, are there any questions so far? I'll pause for like 2 seconds. I'm going to try to bring the video camera back.
I have just
Hello.
a comment regarding divergence and what your thought, you've got this test fast, fail fast, adapt fast kind of thing going on with sprints or gates or whatever you want to call it. But is it almost like creativity is doing something you think is wrong and see what happens?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that like when you are diverging, when you are trying to come up with as many solutions as possible, maybe sampling out of distribution and examining something that you might think couldn't be a right solution to begin with is definitely worth exploring and including in your collection of solutions. You then later have to converge, right, to find the solution that best fits. And maybe you find, oh, that I thought that was wrong for a reason, or you find, oh, maybe unexpectedly this actually works. Did that address the comment?
Thanks.
Yeah, and I should again mention, like, these are just these are just 3 specific characteristics or species of creativity, right? There are others, and there are other alternatives to these approaches. For example, the sort of divergence loop, there's this whole idea, there's this alternative to the divergence convergence loop called narrative theory, which is really interesting, as it what it basically looks at is, instead of coming up with as many solutions as possible, to basically construct a story and pull your solutions from that story in almost a sequential pseudo-linear fashion, right? Because the idea is that it performs divergence and convergence at the same time, because the ideas are coming from each other. And this is one alternative, but all that's to say, these are just 3 characteristics, 3 species. There certainly are others. Anything else before I move on to the stuff that we're currently working on? Okay, great. Next I'm going to talk about I want to talk about some work that we're currently working. Working and revising. One of them we've just finished the study for. But essentially, in this work, kind of, we're looking at video communication and kind of the limits of the augmentation and multimodality you can experience in video communication. So, for example, what you're about to see in this video is the person is me, when you're doing your own demo video, oftentimes you are the model. But so what's going to happen is I'm going to make a gesture, I'm going to say some things, and then that text that I say is going to appear on the screen. And then also I can use various gestures to move objects around the screen, such as making images appear and disappear, and also enlarging them or shrinking them. And so essentially, what we're examining in this particular project and examining at this particular line of work are what are the limits of expression and communication that we can have by including as many different modes of interaction as possible. And specifically in this case, we're looking at video conferencing, such as the way I'm speaking to you right now. I think we're all very deeply familiar with video conferencing and video calls and telepresence at this point. So what we're looking at in this particular line of work is trying to include as many different modes of interaction as possible to as many different operations to really enrich and also hopefully make more accessible the modes that we communicate with in video calling. So on the left, on the image on the left here that you see, you can kind of see a little bit of the menu. These are all different kinds of what we're calling operations, or the output, meaning the way that you manipulate things on the screen. And on the right are the various different ways or modes of input. So, and the idea here is that you can use any of these modes of input that you prefer, mapped to any of these particular operations. So gestures, keyboards, mouse, speech, tablet, or combination of the above. And so for the gesture recognition system, we're using this kind of node-based camera vision recognition system that recognizes 17 static and dynamic gestures. And basically the dynamic gestures are made from static gestures. So we begin performing a static gesture, and when we end performing the static gesture, the operation occurs in between those two indices. So in the case that I start making a gesture, such as pointing my finger, and then I move my finger around the screen, it allows me to draw until I stop making that gesture, and hopefully I can draw something like a house. And the voice recognition system has a couple of different modes of recognition as well, including a keyword recognition system or an embedded recommendation system. I can talk about about that if there are questions after the talk. And so our idea was we wanted to create as many modes of interaction as possible to allow for this enriched augmentation of video conferencing and chatting. And so the modes that we enabled were, again, gesture, voice, mouse, external devices such as tablets and keyboards. And the idea here is that you can use any of these modes to perform any of the operations on the right. So you can draw with your voice, you can display text with your keyboard, you can summon and dismiss things with gesture, or a combination of the above. And so we're currently conducting some user studies to examine not only how useful this could be for enriching communication, but also how it affects people with a wide variety of different disabilities, and does it make this sort of enriched communication a bit more accessible. And kind of similarly in that vein, we can think of multimodal interaction as a negotiation, where the preferences and abilities of the person presenting the information can be matched with the preferences and capabilities of a person observing the information. And so in this particular project, we're looking again at video conferencing and seeing how accessible certain tools are for people who are presenting information, as well as for people consuming information, because they've become increasingly, it's probably no surprise, there have been an increasing number of tools that have become available to help people while they are presenting information in virtual spaces. And so in this particular project, we're examining we're collecting those tools as well as co-designing new tools to help people with various disabilities. In this case, we started with our first use case, which is people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So this project originally started out as we wanted to find sort of the pressure points that virtual spaces had for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we actually found, surprisingly, people who are deaf or hard of hearing actually prefer virtual spaces over physical spaces for learning material for a wide variety of reasons, such as they can adjust audio as they need. Subtitles are more reliable when they're virtual. They can rewind as much as they need. And what we found is that while oftentimes these virtual classrooms are helpful for receiving information, they're not always helpful for discussions or for when they have to present or vocalize things. And so we prototyped a suite of tools as well as collected tools from other state-of-the-art sources to examine how accessible these spaces actually are for people who may be deaf and need to present information in virtual spaces. I should probably note that on the right here, these are not the actual participants from our study. Thank God, because getting my cat to hold still for the video was quite a feat. No, these are essentially, we couldn't de-anonymize any of our participants in the demo video, so we had to have some stand-ins for our participants. And again, getting my cat to hold still for this demo video was quite a feat. So let's just maybe quickly look at some of these tools that we have here. So one of the tools that we've prepared is this accessibility accommodation request system. So essentially anyone in the group can make any kind of accessibility accommodations that they would like, and these are mediated by the session host. And once they have been approved by the session host, they then appear here in this etiquette guideline box. And there are also tools here to provide notifications. Should someone, be repeatedly not adhering to maybe one of these etiquette guidelines, any member of the session could send a gentle reminder to everyone in the group of that specific piece of accessible etiquette. And the idea here is that the system creates a mechanism for communally reinforcing these etiquette guidelines and making the space more inclusive for everyone. We next up here also have a suite of automated tools, including this system for spoken volume. So the spoken volume system uses an impedance algorithm essentially to give real-time feedback based on the volume of the person speaking. And it has these two tools attached to it, such as an increase and decrease volume button, which we're calling a human volume button, for lack of a better term. Essentially, the idea here is that it allows the audience to provide preferences to the speaker about, how their volume is, and the automated system adjusts the range of recommended volume accordingly. We have a similar tool down here for speech speed to make sure that someone's, not rattling off too quickly and becoming difficult to follow. We also have an audio playback button because oftentimes in these virtual audio sessions, the voice of the person speaking is muted out of the audio volume. And so what this allows you to do is, say, if you're using a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, you can plug your aux cable directly into that cochlear implant or that hearing aid. And this allows you to amplify your own voice so you can hear yourself while speaking. So one way we can think of this suite of tools is that they are a multimodal coach that leverages what the current audience is using and used to magnify and ensure that information is being clearly presented. So this was part of a co-design project, much like the Poker Face project, where we collected design ideas from our various formative and user studies. And in our And we're currently in the process of running validation studies to find exactly how usable and how accessible this actually makes these sort of social computation spaces. But one of the tasks that we have users perform in our validation study is we have them do a drawing task. And so I'd like to conclude by just sharing this really delightful drawing made by the group during one of the user studies that features a cat bus and an alien playing or dreaming of a cat bus. I just find this delightful. I really wish I could replace the entire paper with just the images from the study. But anyway, all of that is to say, that sort of concludes what I wanted to talk about today. If you have any questions, you can reach me on Twitter or on the social network called email, or I think, of course, we have time for questions. You can ask me right now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Josh. Questions, anyone? Yes.
How is your own creative practice informed by the human studies that you do?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a really great question. So oftentimes, like a lot of these tools that that I'm making, I am definitely in the target group of users, right? So for example, like the multimodal video computation project, one of the things that we saw people doing with that tool was basically drawing on the screen to create costumes for themselves, like give themselves small little crowns or give themselves mustaches, and then it follows their face around the screen. So they basically can use this as a costuming tool. And so it's neat to see people use the system in ways that's not intended to kind of, it gives me really exciting ideas for other ways that I might possibly be able to use it as well. And it's also just nice to see different approaches to creativity and the different kind of things that people like to make. I think, and then also kind of tangential to that is, I think one element of creativity for me that's really important is this kind of sense of play, and being around and people who are enjoying and playing and making things is definitely, it definitely is helpful for motivation.
Could you perhaps say a few things about personal creativity as distinct from historical creativity?
As a distinct from, what was the last word?
Historical. Creativity, historical creativity. Creativity that happens once and then it becomes personal.
Oh, interesting. Can you maybe tell me what you mean? What you? I think
Sure.
I'm having trouble with the idea.
I don't happen to have a toddler, but if I had a toddler, she or he would probably be creative every day in kindergarten, and the pictures would show up on my refrigerator. But the invention of a helicopter, something that happens once.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, I think that like when we are creative people and we have some form of a creative practice, you have to determine at one point, where do you sample things that you've made from that creative practice and present them to the world, right? So that's definitely an example of like a historical product of creativity, right? I can sit around and I can invent things all day long, but I have to eventually choose which of these inventions that I actually want to show the world. The helicopter in this case, right? I have to show this invention to the world. I guess like when you're trying to select things, it really does come back to that kind of cultural divergent mode, right? Like what exactly are you trying to show people? What exactly are you trying to solve? I mean, so one of the projects, I can if I can bore you with a little bit of a personal anecdote. When we were working on this one project, basically with the new school, one thing that they wanted to work on was the base tenet was that they had this idea where they had all of this text that had been created by one of their colleagues, and they wanted to use something involving machine and computation in order to produce a memoriam project for their colleague, right, who had just passed away. And oh my God, we spent months and months and months bouncing around ideas, because you have a room full of creative people and all of them have their different wild ideas. I mean, we had all sorts of things. We at one point were going to like bioengineer like these small atoms, and then or these small like not atoms, but like these small like funguses, and then imbue using DNA techniques, the writing into the fungus. Like we had these ideas where we were going to train these machines to create images, to create texts that use their colleagues' texts. We had this satellite idea at one point in time. We were going to launch a satellite into orbit. And so you have a group full of creative people together who are used to being really, really playful and expressive on a daily basis. And you have to kind of corral that and choose like, what is the one idea that actually solves the problem, or actually kind of speaks to the problem space that we're trying to examine. And so that's yeah, no, I don't have a hard and fast solution for exactly how you find that. I think that there's still something to be said for it still just feeling right, depending on how loose and formative your creative space is. Yeah, did that address your question? I went a bit on a tangent there.
Do you want to say anything about creative communities as opposed to individual creativity?
Yeah, that's another great question. Yeah, I mean, like, because then it kind of brings into question what is exactly your creative community, right? Because time and time again, I think about like there are artists who regularly participate in creative communities, right? They're in guilds, they go to the salon, like they may be in collectives. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I thought someone said something, sorry. So like they may be in collectives, and so they have access to these regular communities that are really essential for their vibrant creativity. But then again, you do have these kind of, ghosts of these legendary artists who lived in isolation their entire time. Like Emily Dickinson, of course, being a prototypical example. But I do think then there is still something to be said for their community existing within the artifacts of the products that they, or not products, but the products of their creativity that they encounter, right? I mean, even Emily, one could argue, had a creative community because she was reading all of these books by these amazing, wonderful people. She had access to these wonderful poems and collections. And even in solitude, that can be a kind of community, right? I think anyone who's an artist in this particular room probably has an example of an artist that they have never met, but being truly moved by their work. And I think that definitely could qualify as a form of community, even when it's experienced in solitude. So, yeah.
In any of your accessibility studies, have you, you've talked about blind and deaf, but have you had, cerebral palsy or Downs or something on the autism spectrum participating?
Yeah, that is a great question. So in the mask study, we did have part of that study was actually working with people who had neurodivergent disorders. We had a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder involved in that study. And really we found and it's anyone working in accessibility will tell you, the preliminary results really can only speak to one community, right? Like we go into accessibility research, we want to help everyone. We want to make this accessible and usable for as many people as possible. But oftentimes your solution really only can speak to maybe one community if you're lucky, right? One size definitely doesn't ever fit all. And so one thing we saw in that project was that people with autism spectrum disorders really, they could not handle having anything on their face at all. Like it was too constraining, it was too confining. If they felt their breath on their face at all, they would immediately take off the mask. And so it was such a wider, it kind of spoke to such a wider problem with masks and this particular community. There's really wonderful work by Kata Spiel, for example. Like part of her work is looking, or part of their work, sorry, is looking at specifically at designing accessible work for autism spectrum and neurodivergent disorder children. And it is a whole feat unto itself. So I guess that is my very long-winded way of saying that we've done some preliminary work with these particular communities, but each of these communities really does, when examining individual needs, really does require substantial individualized attention to try to find a design that actually is potentially helpful. And I will say the thing that kind of, for me personally, that I really do like about this research is when you do find a design that works, it's an actual solution to an actual problem. And that's really, really, really exciting. Like when we were working on tangible circuits, we had a lot of the users in the study get excited and be like, oh, when can I use this? When can I use this now? Like, I really would love to be able to keep playing with it. So we wound up putting a tool online. But yeah, it's exciting when it works. And often you really do have to specify the community that you're working with. I think I wandered off again there, but I hope I addressed the question.
That's great, thanks.
Thank you.
This wasn't covered in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how, I guess, your experience with creativity or with the creative practice informs the way you document and articulate research. Because I, for one, I was in the room when Michaela presented the alt-chi paper of alternative comic narratives, and I've been fascinated by this other side to your work, where you're looking at these creative, thought-provoking ways of communicating research, which is traditionally just a drab 2-column textual paper. But just your thoughts on that and the way you approach that process.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. That was a really fun paper. So like one of the things we're combating against, or not combating against, but one of the things you bump up against quite often in the research community is, like you said, this very traditional way of presenting research material. It is a 2-column paper. It is very visual. Yes, there is alt text that may be readable by a screen reader, but maybe is not. And that kind of limits who has access to, and also how engaging that particular material is. And so, yeah, thank you for bringing up the alt-chi paper. One of the things that we did was we started questioning, like, what are there different ways we as a research community can present this material to not only make it more engaging, but also possibly make it attenuate to different communities. So what we did in this one particular paper was we basically, the paper itself was all images, and we embedded the text of the paper inside the alt captions of the images. And what we found was that often during the reviewing process, not only had most accessibility researchers never used a screen reader themselves, but also the system by the Association of Computing Machinery responsible for storing and distributing these papers was not equipped to handle captions that were sufficiently detailed enough to actually communicate complex ideas. And one thing we might publish later is actually just the emails back and forth with the Association of Computing Machinery, where we basically had to like figure out how we broke the TAP system is essentially what happened, and trying to figure out how to actually still store our paper. And so there's this whole other avenue of research that we can really go into, is exactly how is it that we as research practitioners, who are very creative people, we are researchers, we are very creative people, we have to find solutions to very complicated problems, and that's a creative practice, right? But how is it that maybe even the way we're sharing this information can be significantly improved, challenged, or even completely rethought? Yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. That was a really fun project. One day I might I can make a whole other talk kind of stringing together the different research projects that we looked at, basically just kind of looking at alternative ways to present research material to these communities. Thank you.
Well, building off of that, I read a paper recently that you're on a little bit closer. I read a paper recently that you were in, and it was about research through design. And I'm not sure if it's one of the papers you already talked about, but I'm wondering if that methodology to doing research where your design work is actually, generating academic knowledge, if that specific approach is still resonating with you right now, or if there's other methodologies for doing creative research that are more interesting to you right now.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think like the current line of research, yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. No, I think like for a while, there's still a whole other like double life that I have where kind of the questions that we're asking are, how is academic knowledge itself reproduced inside these spaces? And can we produce knowledge inside these spaces that challenges that exact hierarchy, right? Like that's kind of one of the goals, or one of the ideas is like, can we actually produce, use the means and communication viabilities within this system to challenge the issues of it within itself? And that's still a very, I think that for those of you who go to Alt-Chi, that's one of the things Alt-Chi at its best does this. It really does like challenge and use avant-garde approaches to research methodologies. But my current, kind of some of the more current projects that I've been working on, they're very tool focused, they're very solution focused. And I almost like, for some of these projects, I'm almost at a point where I am more interested in just polishing the tool to a place to where it's usable and actually useful, and then releasing it to the people who could actually use it to benefit their lives, even more so than publishing the results of any sort of academic work. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nearing the end of the hour. Any last questions from people on Zoom, maybe? Or in the room, anyone at all?
I can also just show lots of pictures of my cat to fill the time. Right.
Well, in that case, thank you so much, Josh. This was a fascinating talk. There's contact details up.
Thank you so much. It was really great speaking with you all today. Thank you for your attention.